senators, distinguished guests, dear friends in Chile. I was invited by the Senate here to speak for this Congresso Futuro in context with a film I made, Theater of Thought. Theater of Thought is about research into brain, not only the human brain, but brain in general. And its enormous repercussions right now and for the future, and also for the significant changes that are waiting for us to answer in legal terms, to create new legal norms for protecting us. For example, we can read our thoughts to some good degree by implanting chips in our brain. But of course, what happens if the CIA, for example, implants chips in your brains? And I find it most fascinating that Chile is at the vanguard of the legal question about it, and your country will be the first country to incorporate the human right of freedom of thought, the autonomy of thought, into its very constitution. So it's absolutely sensational. Your country is a sheer, true vanguard of what is coming at us. Yes, I congratulate your country and the political foresight. I had the feeling there were much better people, and they will come tomorrow, for example, to speak about brain research. Rafael Yuste, who is a guiding person through my film, and others. And there are much better experts for the legal questions, articulations of new human rights. So spontaneously I said, I would like to speak about something about the future, and spontaneously as an idea I said I would like to speak about the future of truth. Because truth has always engaged me in all my work as a poet, as a filmmaker. So I'm not a scientist, a poet is speaking to you. It has been a guiding principle in my work, a search for truth. But here comes the immediate disconcerting question: what is truth? In fact, nobody knows it. We do not know. Philosophers cannot give you an answer. Mathematicians cannot give you an answer. Not even the Pope in Rome can give you an answer. I have to point out a Persian proverbial saying, and it has to do with God. And it means, in its essence, it says, God had a big mirror, and this mirror was truth. But God dropped the mirror, and it broke in millions of little shards and smithereens. So, and we as human beings had the possibility to pick up a shard and look in it, and each of us has a tiny fragment of what truth is. So I like this because it's a very poetic way to explain our problems. We know from brain research that our brains are very, very unreliable. We know from one of the most prominent scientists in brain research, Jack Gallant, that, and he says it verbatim, there is no truth in the human brain. And he means, of course, that has to be much more exemplified, but he means, among other things, that memories are shifting. We construct part of our memories. It's unreliable, and I can give you a very fine example in my film on the internet, Lo and Behold. I am quoting the German war theoretician of the Napoleonic times, von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz, in his study on war, famously said, "Sometimes war dreams of itself." It's an incredible statement, and I continue with this statement, and I'm asking early scientists and early proponents of the internet, does the internet dream of itself? And of course, nobody has an answer. But now comes the interesting part. After the film was shown, I was contacted by scholars who wrote to me, Clausewitz never said this. And I thought I must have invented it decades ago, because his statement, "War sometimes dreams of itself," has been with me for many, many years. So I must have invented it. And having invented it, I must have talked myself over decades that Clausewitz wrote that, so that I believe, and I still somehow believe, that von Clausewitz must have said it. So it only shows that my own memory is not reliable. I make up memories. I wrote memoirs recently, and I went back to my siblings, my brothers, who lived through the same incident with me, have different recollections. So how do we shape it? How do we create memories? They're certainly not really very reliable. Equally, history is a construct. History has to do with perspectives. It has to do with inventions. Do not trust a book of history. Ask other sources. Go back, study the environment, study the perspectives, and you would know. Even our bodies mislead us. It has happened with people who had a leg amputated, that months later they still have terrific, terrifying phantom pains. They feel pain in a leg that they do not have anymore. So what is the brain doing with us? How do we respond to this? Sometimes even our feelings, our emotions have to be questioned. And since I have staged operas, Italian operas, for example, and there's one opera where the protagonist very early in the first act hears a voice from way backstage, a female voice, and he stops and he sings "Qual voce," what a voice. And he immediately falls in love with this woman whom he does not know. He does not know how she looks like. He doesn't know about her life. He only has heard a little bit of her voice. He falls in love so deeply that he is dying for her at the end of the opera. So in other words, it's a reduced form of emotions that exist in opera. I call it, like in mathematics, like axioms of emotions. And we do sometimes go back into the axioms of emotions. Mathematics reduced to its very, very essence, and it cannot be explained any further. And I do remember, for example, when Diana, the Princess of Wales, died in an accident, the kind of public grief, and I think it was genuine grief, but it was also some sort of axioms of grief, axioms of emotions, because none of us had anything in common with Lady Di, and yet the outpour of emotions was somehow genuine. And it's very, very strange how our brain, our thinking, our emotions can be misled, can be guided. For me, the best and clearest way to explain what truth is the ancient Greek term for truth, aletheia, and it has the root in the verb lantarnein. Lantarnein means to hide, to obscure, and aletheia means to take it out of obscurity, a process, a dynamic process, to take you out, to take something out that is hidden, bring it to light, explain it. And still you do not have the full meaning what truth is. The ancient Greeks didn't know it either. In this context, it is interesting that it has to do in a way with cinema, earlier forms of cinema with celluloid. You expose a celluloid to light, to a scene, to people, to a portrait or whatever, and now you have to do chemical processes, dynamic processes, procedures to lift the latent, invisible image that is stored there, that is hidden there, to lift it out to visibility. So the ancient Greek meaning of truth, the exposing, the making visible something that has been hidden, has been for me the closest way to explain, for me at least. It always will be an approximation. I also do believe that in our brains there's a certain tolerance for lies embedded. This is a huge subject and I do not go further into it. I just would like to mention it. And of course truth has different shapes and appearances. I recently made a film on Bruce Chatwin, who has traveled here in Chile. He was in Punta Arenas. He was on the Isla Navarino in the island of Chiloé. And we were friends. And he was always exuberant, full of stories, a great poet, a great writer. And what is interesting, when he died, his biographer, Nicholas Shakespeare, explained to me, you never would have a half-truth from Bruce Chatwin. What he gave you was a truth and a half, which is a very beautiful way to explain Bruce Chatwin. But beyond this half-truth, or truth and a half, lies a deep concern today, and it has to do with fake news. We are overwhelmed with fake news, and we know, for example, statistically, that fake news, that lies, spread on the internet 3 times faster than correct information. So there's an explosive dynamic of fake news, and it's kind of alarming. But I have to point out that fake news, lies, historical lies, are nothing new. They have been in history as long as we have written documentation. And I give you a few examples. One is the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses the Great, 15th century before Christ, in an inscription on a temple, boasts of his magnificent victory over the Hittites. However, we have a later peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites, and it very clearly states that Ramses did not win the battle. The battle was actually inconclusive. There was no winner. So some of the very earliest documentation of history is already fake. I would like to point out hundreds of years later to the second Roman king, Numa Pompilius. He started his reign in 715 before Christ, reigned for 40 years in Rome as a kingdom, and he created enormous amounts of of historical and religious fictions, which solidified Rome, which brought it into a long, almost perpetual life. And he claimed that he was in dialogue, in nightly dialogue with a nymph. And the nymph would whisper to him certain things that he should bring to Rome. Rome in its earliest days under Romulus was very warlike. He wanted to have a peaceful nation. He wanted to solidify things through religious rites that he invented. He wanted justice. He, for example, introduced the Vestal Virgins. He, for example, invented the religious office of the Pontifex Maximus, a title which, by the way, the Pope in Rome adopted later, and still today the Pope also has the title Pontifex Maximus, the one who builds a bridge to God. But it's an ancient Roman concept going back to Numa Pompilius. We have seen fake Neros. After the suicide of the Roman Emperor Nero, suddenly fake Neros appeared in northern Greece. One or two, I think, also in Asia Minor. And they showed up with great pomp, with slaves and soldiers and bodyguards and musicians in their entourage, and claimed to be Nero. Very interesting that self-proclaimed itself in such solid, fanatical ways. By the way, all these fake Neros met a bad fate. They were all executed. They didn't last long. One of the greatest fake news and forgeries is certainly the donation of Constantine, allegedly dating back to the early 4th century, but it came up in the middle, around the middle of the 8th century, around 750, where there was great shifts in political power. The earliest Frankish kings, the dynasty of the Merovingians, was displaced by the first Carolingians. And they made contact with Pope Stephen, and he in turn at that time presented documents that half of Italy, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, and some other territories were gifted, were donated by the Emperor Constantine hundreds of years prior. A complete fabrication, a complete forgery. And it was understood since Renaissance times that it was a complete forgery, but for centuries, the Vatican state was more than half of Italy. Today it has shrunk to a few hectares, but it's still a country and still based on the donation of Constantine. And what is interesting in context with the donation and the first claim of the donation was Stephen, the Pope Stephen II, and the first Carolingian king, Pepin the Short, who acknowledged it, and it was a mutual exchange of services between church and secular power. In this context, I would like to point out to a conversation I had with Mike Tyson, the heavyweight boxer, the youngest who ever became heavyweight champion. Mike Tyson, and I tell you this story because it has to do with nuances of truth, with how do we see a person, what do we know, what kind of perspective and preconceived ideas we cast on them. Mike Tyson had a catastrophic childhood. His mother, a prostitute, he was living in only one room with her, and she had her clients in his presence. He would steal from the pockets of the men. He was actually 40 times arrested before he was 11 years old. During the time of his juvenile imprisonments, he became a boxer, and he started to read. Later, when he was convicted of rape, he spent 4 or 5 years in prison and started to read voraciously. But I'm speaking of the man who, in the ring against Evander Holyfield, bit off half the ear of Evander Holyfield and was labeled the baddest man on the planet. And the baddest man on the planet had a very, very wonderful conversation with me about Stephen, about Pepin the Short, about early Frankish kings, and about the Roman Republic. So that's phenomenal, and we should never, 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 never underestimate a person that is vis-a-vis you. So Mike Tyson, and he actually repeated a long discourse at the New York Public Library in front of many intellectuals, and nobody among them knew who Pepin the Short was, nobody. But Mike Tyson spoke about him. So, and of course, let me go quickly into some other things like the so-called Potemkin's villages, the favorite and lover of Katerina the Great, showing how orderly his governorship is, creates fake villages, only facades, when she is traveling to the Crimea, and the facades were quickly moved a few miles ahead and put up again so that she would see how wonderful the country was administered. Many, many more. I do not go into any more of this, but one I would like to mention. Of course, there's very sinister fake news that have had catastrophic consequences. For example, the invention, and it came in the Middle Ages already, the fake news that Jewish people murder babies and sometimes they eat them like cannibals. It has perpetuated, and of course later anti-Semitism has ultimately led to the Holocaust, and that was the biggest of all catastrophes of civilization, the biggest, deepest barbarism that the world has witnessed, and it was, and I speak here as a German citizen, it was brought upon us by Germany, my own country. So let's move away from this and let's look at the present possibilities. Conspiracy theories are abundant, and you see them in daily lives. Of course, they bring collective paranoias into a more sharper focus. You probably have heard of the moon landing, that the moon landing allegedly was staged in Hollywood studios, that it's all special effects. You hear it many times, alien abductions. It's an interesting field of collective paranoia, because millions of Americans do believe that they had encounters with aliens. More interesting, though, is that about 300,000 women claim that they not only had encounters with aliens, but they were also gang raped by aliens. Now allow me 2 questions. Question number 1, why are most of these women over 300 pounds heavy? Secondly, why have we never heard of an alien abduction or a gang rape of aliens in a country like Ethiopia, for example? I leave that as an open question here for the audience. Of course, today, deep fakes are possible. We have seen Charles Darwin in Discourse. And of course, what Darwin is doing is basically the common denominator of today's knowledge. It's not inspiring. There's, for example, being asked about climate change, and immediately attributes it to industrialization. Industrialization is not the problem. It's part of the problem, the real deepest of all problems, that in the 20th century the increase of population was from 2 or 3 million to 9 million now. And nobody speaks about it because it's not common denominator yet. And what is not common denominator yet is that most civilizations, most societies are very much into waste of food and things, waste of resources, that they are catastrophically involved in using too many resources. And hardly anyone speaks about that. The culture of consumerism. And Darwin will not speak about the culture of consumerism in artificial intelligence because nobody in the general public speaks about this. Now, of course, we can write essays in artificial intelligence, poems. For example, the president of Chile, who was here half an hour ago, we could ask artificial intelligence, for example, make us a picture, a painting of your president in an underworld surrounded by fairies. And within seconds, very interesting proposals for images, for pictures would pop up. So it's not uninteresting. And some areas of our television viewing, for example, or movie going, seems to be completely safe from forgery. Wildlife films. We know humans always cheat, they always lie. Animals do not lie. But when you look at the making of wildlife films, they are wildly manipulated, wild lies, wild perspectives in it, anthropomorphizing aspects in it. Don't trust in wildlife films either. That seems to be a solid terrain. So what is coming at us is a post-truth era coming at us. I have my doubts, and I will speak about it briefly again. But what is coming at us should be noticed. And it has to do partially, for example, with a decline of reading. We do not read enough. Even students at university do not read enough. We are going too much into certain news that we take from our cell phones, certain algorithms, certain applications, and we take our knowledge and our understanding of reality from something completely artificial. So, and the decline of reading is a process not just started with the internet. It has started decades ago. In the 60s, 70s, you already could sense the decline. We have something which is increasing performative existences. You see them in show business, you see them in politics, the kind of performative aspects. And you see it almost in every country. You do not have to go to the former president of the United States, Trump. You have them everywhere. It's nothing new, nothing so special. And of course, we have a certain tolerance for that. We have performative lives ourselves. When we are in church, for example, we behave differently than, let's say, we would behave in military service. I behave differently speaking to my own children. So we have performative aspects in our lives, and that's not so particularly alarming, only when it seeps over into politics and into news and things like this, then it's more serious. We also are quite accustomed to have paid performers. For example, babysitters. They are paid as a stand-in for the parents. It is not alarming. It's something where we accept a performance that is paid for. And it is also remarkable that Google, for example, doesn't give you only informations. When was Emperor Nero born? When did he die? Google now has shifted into giving you thoughts. They give you, and you have seen it partially with Charles Darwin, not very inspiring thoughts, always a common denominator. And I have to ask myself, do we want to stop thinking? Do we want to stop dreaming? And I think that's an important aspect with which we should approach these new technologies in artificial intelligence. I myself have somehow changed facts in films, even in documentaries, because I do believe that there's a deep underlying intrinsic truth in cinema, also in poetry. And it is not fact-based. Facts, and that's quite often misunderstood, do not illuminate you. They do not inspire you. They do not give you truth per se. They are just facts. But we should not underestimate them, because facts have normative power. When COVID pandemic is coming, the facts is millions of infected ones. The norm is you have to wear a mask in public. So facts are important, but they do not constitute truth per se. And I think cinema verite, the so-called cinema verite, is only a pose. And I have coined a term, the ecstasy of truth, the ecstatic truth, where you step outside of yourself. In Greek means ekstasis, to step outside of yourself, almost like a medieval mystic, and experience something that illuminates you, that's only possible in religious experiences, in poetry, in cinema. So I could go endlessly, but I should do a whole week of seminar about ecstatic truth. I will not do it here. It is just fascinating to look at how previous thinkers and poets have handled it. Shakespeare, for example, as a very strange, mysterious example, has said, the best poetry is the most feigning. The one that founder of a company called Family Romance, Yuichi Ishii, was interviewed by Japanese national television, NHK. And at the end he was asked, can you give us a name and an address of one of your clients who received a friend, let's say an old man who was lonesome. Yuichi Ishii provided name and address of a person, of an old man, and NHK interviewed him and spoke about solitude. The very next day, the internet was full of voices. This old man was an old man, but he was an actor from the stable of Yuichi Ishii's performers and actors. So he had given them a name of one of his own performers. And it was a catastrophe for NHK because losing face is something very important in Japan. They had to apologize in public. And Yuichi Ishii was accused of lying. And now comes the real interesting part, the real interesting side of this. Yuichi defends himself by saying, if I had given the name of a real lonesome old man, he would probably have given you only half the truth. Maybe he would have lied to you because he doesn't want to show and speak in public how lonesome he has been. I sent you a performer. I sent you my performer who has done this job 205 times. And only from the imposter, only from the actor, only from the one who is a paid performer, you will get the real truth. And I think he's right. So truth has many strange facets. It has been around forever. And I'm asking my question again. Are we moving into a post-truth era? I think we are not. Truth has no future, and it had no past either. Thank you very much for your attention. By the way, I do not know if there are announcements yet. I think on Saturday, my film Family Romance LLC will be shown here. In which context, I do not know exactly. Please find out, keep your eyes open. I just landed in Chile last night, so I have to find out myself. But I think it's Saturday, and the film is Family Romance. So I would like you to invite you to this as well. Thank you very much.
Bien.